就要明白到底是什么造成了他们当下的选择，才能够让他们做出更正确的决定。
So let's start with this little scenario right here. So here's a scenario that I'm presenting to you. So let me present the scenario first. So you are a person who's trying to make healthier decisions, and you seem to do well in the first part of the day. So when you wake up and through the morning and lunchtime, you seem to do well. But in the evening, when you come home from school or you come home from work and you're home, you tend to find that it's hard to resist temptations while you're doing the things you do at home. Like you could be watching TV. If you're a student, you could be doing your homework, or you could be on social media. You're noticing it's really hard to resist the temptation of eating or snacking.
我们现在来看一下关于吃的一个比较常见的场景。通常大家在白天的时候意志力都是比较坚定的，我们可以很好的完成自己的工作跟学习，不去考虑太多的食物上的诱惑。但是你会发现到了晚上，虽然我们经历了白天非常多的工作跟学习之后，意志力很明显的就会出现下降，这个时候对于零食的诱惑的抵制能力就会变得很差。
And so you've tried a few strategies. Maybe you read this somewhere. Maybe someone told you to try it. So the first thing you tried is you said, I must get these snacks and hide them away. We use the word out of sight, out of mind.
我们通常能够想到的解决方法会有很多，你也可能会尝试很多的方式，但是你会发现你会选择把零食藏起来，或者是试着我只吃其中的一小部分。
You might have even tried to say, well, I'm going to have the snack, but I'm just going to have a small portion. That's it. But then you find yourself eating a second portion and a third portion. So you are struggling with all these strategies and they're just not working.
你虽然尝试只吃零食当中的一小部分，但是通常情况下我们都会忍不住把剩下的东西吃掉，所以你会发现这样的方式对你来说可能是没有效果的。
And so let's think about this. In the morning, you are more effective at resisting the temptation to snack or to make bad decisions, but you struggle more in the evening. So we have to understand why.
我们来想一下，为什么在白天的时候你能更好的抵制诱惑，但是到了晚上的时候却很难做到这一点呢？
Is there something specific about the evening where the trigger or the stimulus or the cue that is activating that craving is different from what it is in the morning?
到底是晚上什么样的刺激让你产生了这样对食物的渴望，让你的意志力区别于白天不能够很好的发挥？
And sometimes we decide, okay, I'm going to allow myself to have a snack. We have the snack, and then maybe later we feel guilty about it. We regret our decision because we think, now I've eaten too many calories.
很多时候我们在经历了一番挣扎以后，会想说那我就让自己去吃吧，但是你吃完之后又经常会后悔自己做出的决定，认为自己摄入了太多的热量。
You've even tried these strategies. You try to hide your snacks. You try to use small portion sizes. They just don't seem to be working.
你尝试了各种各样的方式，但是这些方式通常对你来说都没有效果。
So we look at this scenario, and this is characteristic of what a lot of people experience, that they seem to do good during the day, but then as we get to the evening, they tend to sometimes make some bad choices.
我们大部分的人都经历过这样的场景，在白天的时候自制力很强，但是晚上的时候经常会做出一些错误的决定。
So we keep thinking, what else can I do? I've already hidden the food. I'm using small portion sizes. It doesn't seem to be working. Well, that's what this session is about. We have to dig deeper and understand the behaviors and what is actually triggering that weakness in the evening.
我们做了这么多的尝试都没有效果，是因为我们没有看到行为背后的一些动机的因素，导致我们去做出了这样的一个决定。
So let's appreciate some things. Changing behavior is not easy, because if it was, you could do it anytime.
改变行为这件事情呢，其实非常的不容易，因为如果很容易的话，我们就可以在随时随地做出任何的改变了。
And so a lot of times people will say, if you don't like something, change it. Well, we know it's never that easy, because when it comes to behavioral change, there's a lot of pieces that have to be explained and understood, and sometimes they're not easy to figure out.
很多时候改变它是一个非常复杂的过程，它中间包含了很多的部分，我们都需要了解它，可以给它一个合理的解释之后，能够更好的做出改变。
And some of these influencing variables are controlled at a conscious level where we are aware of them, but sometimes they're controlled at a subconscious level, which means we might not even know that it's influencing our decisions to eat unhealthy.
很多时候与改变相关的一些变量，它可能影响的不是我们的意识，而是潜意识，所以有的时候你根本没有办法发现它正在影响着我们。
So the best thing you can do as a trainer, as a coach, whatever you want to call yourself, is to have a mindset where you're always striving to understand.
所以对于一个营养专家或者是教练来说，我们非常重要的是要从理解这些行为背后的动机开始。
And so to build on that concept, my first guideline to you is live by 4 fundamental rules.
我首先要给到大家的一个意见就是，我们要通过4个技巧来达到这样的一个目的。
Most people know they need to eat less or eat more healthily. Most people know they need to be more physically active, but they don't do it. Why?
很多的人他们都知道自己应该少吃一点，吃得健康一点，应该多去运动，但是通常他们都是做不到的，这是为什么呢？
So the first thing we need to do is we need to start asking questions, and we need to start listening to why people won't make healthier choices, why they won't be physically active. Never assume, never tell people, start asking and listening.
很多时候我们应该做的不是提非常多的问题，而是应该学会倾听，理解这些人为什么不去做更健康的选择，为什么不去更积极的运动，了解他们做这些背后的因素是什么。
And by asking and then listening, what you are starting to do is to understand why they may not be changing, why they cannot resist temptation, why they're hesitant about doing something healthy. You start to understand where they're coming from.
通过将提问和聆听这2件事情配合在一块儿，我们才能更好的了解为什么人们无法做出更健康的饮食选择，为什么他们不愿意去更好的运动。
And only once you understand what their challenges are, then you as the expert can start to respond by designing your interventions.
只有当你理解了他们不愿意去做出行为改变的背后因素的时候，你才能够给他们提供更好的支持和帮助。
So here's what I'll tell you to do. You see on the slide, I talk about doing more of certain things and doing less of other things.
接下来我就要跟大家讲一讲，大家可以看到我们在图片上面有为大家罗列出来，我们应该多做的事情有哪一些，少做的事情有哪一些。
So when we have a client that comes to us and is struggling with, snacking, maybe they're not exercising on a regular basis, we need to start asking questions and listening, but truly listening, being immersed in that experience of listening to everything they're saying. And we need to stop telling people, you just need to go do this and go do that. They know they need to do that, all right? Don't tell them, start listening.
当我们的客户来寻求帮助的时候，我们应该做的是通过询问来引发他们的思考，并且认真的、真正的做到倾听，在倾听的过程中去理解他们，而不是直接给出命令和建议，让客户去做某些事情。很多时候他们都知道自己应该怎么做，只是他们无法完成这些行为。
Remember, your job as a coach is to empower the person. So what you need to do is help them explore and help them discover for themselves what they are struggling with and how to change it. So rather than thinking what's best for them and telling them what to do, focus rather on this process of self-discovery. Help them find their own solutions.
作为一个教练，我们更应该做的事情是帮助客户去发现自己，让他进行自我探索，而不是直接用我们以为正确的方式去指导他们。
We need to stop worrying about being understood. We are people that have a lot of information. We have a lot of knowledge and a lot of skills. A lot of times we think we just need to share that with people. The reality is, don't try and be understood. Take a moment to understand where they're coming from.
很多时候我们就喜欢拿自己的一些专业知识和技巧来教育客户，但更多的时候我们应该学会真正的理解客户，支持他们去做出自己的选择。
Empower them to choose. Don't coerce them to doing what you think is right, because there is a psychological concept called a psychological term called psychological reactance that may come back to be a bad problem.
我们要做的事情是给客户赋能，支持他们去做出一些自主的选择。
Psychological reactance is this phenomena that happens when a person believes that their right to choose or their choices are being taken away, kind of like a diet. Think of what a diet is. A diet takes away your choices. If I tell you, you need to exercise 4 days a week, I'm taking away your right to choose. Over time, if you feel that your right to choose is being taken away, you're going to start to resist and rebel.
如果你只是告诉客户应该要去做什么的话，长时间以来他就没有办法更好的去遵循你告诉他要去做的这些事情。
And one thing I would like you to think about as a trainer is be curious. Try and explore different ideas. Don't just do what you've always done. So don't be complacent by doing the same thing over and over again. Every person is different. So always explore new ideas. Be curious to try new things, because sometimes that's where you find some good solutions.
作为一个教练，我们很重要的是要保持好奇心，不能太过于自满，因为我们很多时候过于自满就会用到很多模式化的方式去对待客户，但每一个人都是不一样的，我们应该寻找不同的方式。
And why that's important is because at the end of the day, if I ask a trainer, what business are you in? They might say, well, I'm trying to make people healthy. No, you're in the business of providing experiential solutions. And remember, the decisions you make are driven by how you think and how you feel. So if I give you positive experiences, it's going to change the way you think, it's going to change the way you feel, and you're more likely to stick with the program.
我们很多时候会问教练，你在从事的是一个什么样的事业？大部分的教练会回答，我只来帮助大家获得更好的健康。但事实上，我们要从主观的意愿上面，还有我们的一些思维上面去帮助大家去进行改善。
Okay, so let's do a little bit of a deeper dive now. So let's start to understand some of the things that influence our decisions. We're going to start with willpower. So I'm going to start with this explanation of willpower and how it works in the brain.
好，我们接下来要跟大家一起来探讨一下意志力这个话题，以及它在我们的大脑当中究竟是如何运转的。
So first, let's define it. So it goes by many definitions. All right. Some people call it your self-discipline, your self-control, but basically it is your ability that you have to resist short-term temptations or to override unwanted thoughts, feelings, or actions. That's really a good definition of willpower.
很多时候意志力在我们生活当中有非常多的名词，比如说驱动力、决心、自律、自控能力等等，但它其实都是讲的我们如何抵御短期的诱惑，来达到长期目标的一种能力，或者是我们克服一些不想要的想法、感觉和冲动的能力。
But what's interesting about willpower is how it works. They believe it works like a muscle. So in the morning, after you wake up, your muscle is rested, which means it can do a lot of work. But once it starts doing a lot of work, it gets fatigued, which means the muscle doesn't work very well. Willpower is believed to work in the very same way.
意志力的运转方式其实跟我们的肌肉是非常相似的，它是一种非常有限的资源。早上我们起来的时候，肌肉是充满力量的，意志力也是一样的。但是当它经历了一天大量的消耗之后，到了晚上就很容易被耗竭。
And so, like the muscle, in the morning when you wake up, your brain is rested. It's like a muscle that's being rested. And so in the morning, you have an agenda. Your brain is focused. You get out, you tackle your challenges for the day, but you are making many decisions through the day. And as the day goes on and on, just like a muscle, when it gets tired, your brain gets tired and your willpower weakens as you get to the end of the day.
我们每天早上醒来的时候，自控能力是非常强的，但是随着你一整天不停的工作，不断的去做出各种各样的决策，到了晚上的时候，我们的自制力就会变得非常的弱。
Now, willpower is believed to be part of the governing of our decision-making process. But how it works is that they believe there's two systems that are always fighting with each other.
自制力是帮助我们去管理决策的一个非常重要的过程，但它主要是由两个部分来决定的。
Now, the first system is called the cool system. It's kind of in the front of the brain. It's your rational part of your brain where you make good decisions, you can analyze, you can exercise self-control. We call that the cool system.
第一个部分叫做冷系统，它主要是我们的认知能力的部分，它可以让我们更好的去做出正确的决定，来帮助我们进行自我控制。
The other system is called the hot system. It's more in the middle of the brain where our emotions are regulated, and it generally governs impulsive decisions where we make decisions without thinking about the consequences.
第二个部分叫做热系统，它更类似于一种冲动的部分，它如果出现的情况比较多的话，就会让我们在不加思考立刻做出很多的决定。
So, your ability to exercise self-control and make good decisions happens when the cool system is dominating. Your decision where the process where you make bad decisions like impulsive eating or making decisions that you regret is governed by the hot system.
通常情况下，我们能够非常好的进行自我控制并做出正确决定的，利用的都是冷系统。而如果你经常冲动的决定了某些不好的事情，用的都是热系统。
And so in the morning, when your brain is rested, the cool system dominates. That's why you are often finding it easier to control bad behaviors like snacking and all these types of things, because in the morning when your brain is rested, the cool system dominates. But as your brain gets tired, the hot system starts to take over, like at the end of the day.
通常早上的时候，我们的冷系统的工作能力会比较强，这就是为什么你能更好的自我控制。但是到了晚上的时候，热系统它会占据更大的主导位置，我们就比较容易做出错误的决定。
And so there are exercises you can do to strengthen willpower. We want to strengthen your willpower so the cool system dominates more and the hot system dominates less.
我们现在要对自己的意志力进行的训练，就是让我们的冷系统可以更好的发挥，而热系统的发挥作用可以被抑制。
So here's some exercises you can do. Try these for yourself. You find out how they work, and then you can try them with your clients.
接下来我跟大家介绍一下锻炼我们意志力的一些小的方法，你可以在自己身上去进行练习，也可以帮助你的客户进行类似的练习。
One is to practice what we call self-control. How we do that is whatever you think is going to be a problem in the evening, maybe it's salty foods, maybe it's sweet foods, maybe it's ice cream, whatever it is, you want to expose yourself to those foods in the earlier part of the day where you have a stronger sense of self-discipline and you learn to say no in the morning. That'll also help you say no in the evening.
第一个我们要教大家的小方法叫做自我控制。 好，我们通常到了晚上的时候，都经常会遇到很多的关于饮食上的诱惑，比如说甜食，像冰淇淋这样的。但是我们要不断的去进行练习，不仅仅学会在早上的时候拒绝这些诱惑，还应该在晚上的时候也学会去拒绝这样的诱惑，在你的意志力比较弱的时候，形成更强的一个约束力。
Another thing you can try, like I mentioned in the opening scenario, it works for some people, is in the evening when your temptation is going to be high and your ability to resist is low, get those temptations out of the way, out of sight, out of mind, hide them away, make them more of a hassle than a habit.
我们还可以尝试的方法是，如果晚上的意志力比较弱，经常会受到一些食物的诱惑，我们就可以选择把这些诱惑移除我们的大脑，好，眼不见为净的方式会更好一些。
There's also another strategy that they call an emergency action plan. So when you need it, it's a plan that's there to help you to support your resistance to temptation.
我们还需要注意的是，预防一些突发的状况，紧急时刻你可以使用的一个方法。第一个就是帮助自己去建立一个比较好的社会生态系统，让你能够有更多的社会支持来转移注意力。
So part of this plan, there's 3 ideas. Number 1 is to have what we call a social ecosystem. What that means is having a support system, someone you can talk to, someone who can help you. So whenever you're feeling weak, that you're going to give into temptation, you have that opportunity to talk to that person who actually helps you believe in your abilities to not perform that bad behavior.
我们要去建立一个有效的社会支持，一些在你觉得自己比较脆弱的时候，可以去跟他聊天讲话，可以给你提供支持的人。当你面对这样诱惑的时候，就可以选择向他寻求帮助。
Another thing you can do is we say you can participate in social engagement. So we're all social creatures. So what I need is a distraction. Anytime you're feeling the temptation to eat, so think of the evenings, right? We have a lot of downtime. We've access to food. Our brain is tired. Sometimes we need a distraction. It's nice to have another person to help distract you, as long as that person is not a bad influence. So that might be another way to avoid temptation.
很多时候我们到了晚上之所以会比较容易受到诱惑，还跟我们的情绪会有关系。我们很容易进入到一个比较不开心、心烦意乱或者是失落的环境当中。这个时候选择一个你信任的人，建立社会支持也很重要。
Another strategy you can try is we talk about practicing reflection with gratitude. What that means is whenever you're feeling weak, you're feeling that you're giving into temptation, take a moment and think about what you're grateful for, what you've accomplished that you're proud of. Because what that does, it gives you a little bit of a boost. It changes your mindset, it makes it more positive, and it gives you a little bit more of a boost that can help you fight temptation.
还有一种方法我们也可以尝试，就是在你觉得自己比较脆弱的时候，去想一想什么样的事情让你觉得非常的感恩，人和事都可以，因为这样的一个思考过程会让我们产生更积极乐观的态度，可以帮助我们去抵制诱惑。
The other strategy you can try is the idea that if you anticipate that there's going to be a problem, you can develop a coping strategy. So if you know when I get home, right, that I'm more likely to eat, say, ice cream, you can create a less unhealthy option. Say, okay, I'll have the ice cream, but I'm also going to take my dog for a walk, or I'm going to walk down to the market. You are planning, knowing full well that you're going to have a bad behavior. You're planning something healthy around it so that you're making the best of a bad situation.
很多时候我们也不一定要做一些特别极端的决定，要极端的健康或者极端的不健康。当你特别想要吃，比如说冰淇淋的时候，你可以选择我可以让自己吃一点冰淇淋，但是我要选择我走到超市去购买。这样子的话，相对来说就可以帮助我们做一个更为健康一些的决定。
So, the first part of what you should be trying to do is to appreciate that willpower changes through the day, and most people are going to have struggles in the latter part of the day. So what you want to do as a coach is identify where and when their problems are, and then try and implement some of these ideas to help them fight that weakness or that temptation.
好，我们这个部分呢，主要是希望大家可以了解，意志力它是随着时间的推移，到了晚上的时候会逐渐减弱的。所以作为一个教练，我们应该帮助客户去寻找他在什么时候、什么情况之下，意志力相对是薄弱的，然后通过刚刚教授大家的技巧来帮助他去练习自己的意志力。
Okay, so I've talked a bit about willpower. Now, willpower is usually reflective of behaviors that you started and now you cannot sustain them. We're going to talk about something a little different now called ambivalence or resistance, which actually reflect behaviors that have not yet started for reasons, and we're going to explore those now.
刚刚我们探讨的意志力呢，通常指的是已经开始了某一些行为，但是你没有办法把它很好的维持。接下来我们要探讨的模式是可能没有开始的一些行为。
So let's understand a little bit more about ambivalence and a little bit more about resistance. These are two important things that you should understand so that you can start to get an appreciation for someone who is not willing to start a behavior.
接下来我们要了解的两个非常重要的概念，一个是矛盾，另外是一个阻力。这个也对于我们帮助客户去进行行为改变，了解他们为什么不愿意发生改变来说很重要。
So with ambivalence, what we say is this: the person is aware that they need to change their behavior. So they have the desire or the intention to change behavior, but there's something standing in the way.
矛盾情绪主要讲的是你的客户可能已经意识到自己必须要做出一些改变，但是他总是会遇到一些障碍因素，阻止他发生行为改变。
So what's standing in the way? Well, it could be several things. It could be they don't know what to do. They don't know how to start something. They don't know, what to do. They also may not realize that if they do something, how's it going to benefit them? There might also be a perception that if I do this, it's not going to be fun. So there's a lot of barriers that are standing in the way.
会产生障碍的因素是有非常多的，比如说你的客户不知道应该如何开始，或者是说他不知道他开始之后需要使用到哪一些的知识跟技能，以及他做了这件事情之后会对自己带来哪些好处，这些都有可能会成为他改变的阻力。
One thing that you'll notice is when you're talking to someone who is ambivalent, is that they're talking about the change process. In other words, they're talking about the outcome. So if they say to you, if I start exercising, how many days a week do I need to exercise? If I decide to lose weight, do I have to give up my chocolate? They are talking about the outcome, right? That's a good understanding of someone who wants to change. There's just a few things standing in the way.
对于具有矛盾情绪的客户，我们会发现他们都有一个共同的特点，就是他们更多的把注意力集中在结果上。比如说，如果我要开始运动，我应该一周运动多少次，或者如果我想要吃得健康一点，我应该如何去戒掉巧克力，而没有去探讨更多的过程。
Now, this is very different from someone who's got resistance. With resistance, there may be people that are not aware of how bad their problem is, but more importantly, they may know that there's a problem, but they have no intention to change, at least in the short term. So they're fighting the change.
所以这个对于矛盾情绪的理解来说是非常有帮助的，因为对于他们来说，他们没有办法更好的去支持自己的改变，他们更多的是希望快速的去得到一些结果。
And a classic trait of someone who is resistant is listening to how they talk. So unlike the ambivalent person who is talking about how they want to change and they're exploring ideas about the change, the person who's resistant is playing the role of being a victim. They're saying, it's not my fault, there's just no time. It's not my fault, the weather is not healthy. It's not my fault, there's no healthy food near me. They're playing the role of a victim.
在这个过程当中，有矛盾情绪的客户可能经常会为自己找一些借口和理由，比如说不是因为我不想做，而是因为没时间或者天气不好等等。
And here's the reality. If someone is resistant to change and they keep talking like they're the victim, they will never change behavior because they're going to feel like that it's being forced upon them. So what we have to do is people that are resistant, we have to understand the nature of the resistance and hopefully change that resistance to more ambivalence, because once you've got ambivalence, it's a lot easier to get them to start a behavior.
对于我们的客户来说，我们要意识到，有些人他可能在遇到阻力的时候，他会有很多的害怕跟担心。如果我们能够不要让他觉得自己是一个受害者，能够有更多的方式去发现他的阻力指标的话，会给他得到一个很好的帮助。
And when it comes to people that are resistant, there's 4 types. You can see them right there. There's the rebellious, the resigned, the reluctant, and the rationalizing. They all have their reasons for not wanting to change. But to summarize here, when you are working with someone, even if they tell you, I know I need to change, your job as a health coach, as a nutrition coach, as a personal trainer, is you have to listen to how they're talking about the problem.
我们在这个阻力的过程当中，通常会遇到他们会出现一些叛逆情绪、听天由命的情绪，或者是不情愿、害怕自己不能成功，以及为自己的一些状态合理化的理由。那作为教练来说，我们更多的应该注意客户在讨论自己想要发生改变的过程当中，他是怎么说的。
And so all you have to do is just by listening to them is when they're talking about their challenge, if they seem to be talking and they're exploring the outcomes, such as, how many times a week do I have to go to the gym? Would I have to give up all my beer? Those are people that are not resistant because they're talking about the solutions.
当我们遇到了有一些客户，他们在解释自己的一些挑战的时候，可能会更多的侧重于去聊一些结果，比如说我要花多长的时间每周去健身房。那我们更多的是希望你的客户可以去侧重应该如何解决问题。
And remember, as I said, that's very different from the person who is resistant because they keep talking about the problem and how they're a victim. So if you just listen to how the person talks, you can quickly identify how likely the person is to change behavior. Because as I said to you, a person who's resistant is not going to change behavior until you move them to ambivalence, and then you have a chance of starting behavioral change.
如果这个客户一直处于一个阻力阶段的话，他就没有办法得到一个很好的改变，因为他会一直在为自己找借口跟理由。那这种类型的客户想要去做改变的话很难，除非他们开始产生矛盾心理，想要发生改变的时候，才会有更多的可能性。
Okay, so let's hope that you're dealing with people that have ambivalence and not resistance, because ambivalence is the easier one to change.
好，我们接着来看一下不同类型的矛盾冲突都有哪些，可以帮助我们更好的去了解。
And there's really 4 types of ambivalence. So I'm going to use my hands to kind of explain this concept. So imagine in my right hand is what defines your existing behavior. Let's call it the undesirable behavior, like you not exercising. And my left hand represents the desirable behavior, and let's call that you exercising on a regular basis. So I'm undesirable behavior in my right hand, desirable behavior in my left hand.
好，接下来我要跟大家一起探讨4种比较常见的冲突。我会用我的手来做一个示范。我的右手现在代表的是大家经常容易产生阻力的一些行为，比如说我们不想去健身，而我的左手代表的是一些更积极的选择。
So when we talk about ambivalence, we're talking about people that want to change, but they're hesitant about starting, and we're trying to figure out why. And so that's where we have to look at these 2 behaviors, and we have to explore what kind of ambivalence are they suffering from.
好，那我们在解决矛盾的过程当中会发现，很多人他既想要改变，但是他很容易卡在自己想要改变的这个想法上，没有行动。那我们就通过这个探讨来帮助大家发现为什么。
Now, as I said, there are 4 types of ambivalence. The first one is probably not a situation you're going to experience. That's when someone has 2 choices that they like, and they're torn because they're both equal choices. For example, I might say to you, hey, at 6 o'clock tonight, there's a free dinner if we go to this restaurant. But then your friend calls you and says, at 6 o'clock tonight, I've got tickets to a great movie. You want to do both, but you can't do both, so you have a conflict. That's called approach conflict, it's a good problem to have. So I said we usually don't experience this one much.
第一种叫做双趋冲突，在我们的日常生活当中，对于这种冲突的体验感应该不是很多。我举一个例子来说，比如说今天6点钟有人会给你一顿免费的大餐，而你的朋友有打电话跟你说6点钟他会带你去看电影，在2个你都喜欢的选择的过程当中去进行挑选，就会产生双趋冲突。
Generally, what we experience is the exact opposite, where they have two choices and they don't like either one. So they might think, I don't like not exercising because it makes me feel lethargic and it makes me feel lazy. But I also don't like exercise, and going to the gym 4 times a week doesn't appeal to me. So they hate both choices, right? This is called avoidance conflict.
第二种呢，叫做双避冲突，在你2个都不太喜欢的选择当中，要选择一个相对来说比较弱的。比如说，我既不喜欢在家里面运动，我也不喜欢在健身房运动，这2个都是我不喜欢的，但我要选择一个相对来说影响比较低的。
Another type of ambivalence they could have just focuses on one of the behaviors. So either the current behavior or the proposed behavior. So let's focus just as this example on the proposed behavior. So there's something they like about it, but there's also something they don't like about it. So for example, I know exercise will make me healthier. I know exercise will help me lose weight, and I might be more appealing to someone. But I also don't like exercise because I don't like to sweat and to exert myself. So I have a love-hate relationship with the proposed idea, which is going to the gym on a regular basis. That is called approach avoidance conflict.
第3种叫做趋避冲突，它讲的是一个事物上同时有对你好的吸引跟坏的吸引。比如说我喜欢运动，因为它可以让我看上去更好，让我拥有更好的情绪，让我展示更多的魅力，但同时我也讨厌运动给我带来的压力感以及流汗的感觉。所以运动对于我来说就是一个好坏共存的物体。
So I'm using alcohol as my example there. We know alcohol may not be good for you, but sometimes when you drink, you feel good, you feel less inhibited, and you have a good time. So it's a love-hate relationship with that behavior.
就像我刚刚在表格当中为大家举到的酒精这个例子，也是一样的概念。我们知道喝酒对身体会造成很多的伤害，但同时喝酒的感觉又会让我觉得很快乐、很兴奋。那它对于我来说就是一个好坏共存的物体。
And the last type of ambivalence is what we call double approach avoidance, where you look at both behaviors, the current behavior that we know is not desirable, and the proposed behavior, which we believe to be desirable. But what we have is a situation with the current behavior where we like it, but we hate it. So you might say, I don't like not being in shape. But I also like the fact that the only time I would be able to go to the gym is in the mornings, and I like to sleep in. So you have a relationship where your current behavior is not exercising, you hate that, but you love the fact that you can get to sleep more. And then we look at the other side and you go, yeah, but if I exercise, I'd be healthier, but I also don't like sweating. So you have it's called double approach avoidance, where you're having conflict with both sides, or both the current and the proposed behavior.
最后一个呢，叫做双重趋避冲突，它指的是我们在当前和可替代的选择当中都看了积极的跟消极的一些属性。比如说，今天我特别想要去运动，但是我能够运动的时间只有早上，所以我知道运动它对于我来说有一个很大的好处，就是给我带来好的身材，但同时我又不喜欢运动带来的疲劳感跟出汗的感觉。可是我又知道运动对于我来说是健康的，可是我早上又想要去更好的有一个休息跟睡眠，去睡一个懒觉。所以我们可以看到，在运动当中我们能找到积极和消极的属性，而它的替代性选择睡眠这件事情，我们也能够找到积极和消极的属性。
So this is where I use an example of a relationship. So you might think, I'm in a relationship, I enjoy spending time with another person, but I also don't get along with the person, we fight a lot. So your other idea is, well, you could be single. You might say, I'd like to be single because then I get to do what I want to do. But you also might say, yeah, but I have no one to go to dinner with or go to the movies with. So you have conflict. You see pros and cons on both the current and the alternative options. That's called a double approach avoidance conflict.
以我们比较常见的亲密关系为例，我们有的人可能会思考自己是否应该单身，他也会享受自己和伴侣在一起的感觉。 但是他也会讨厌和伴侣产生冲突的状态。我们也可以享受单身带来的一些独立思考、独立做决定的感觉，但是单身也会给我们带来很多不好的体验，这个时候就会产生双重的趋避冲突。
So, when you've got someone who's ambivalent, as you are talking to them, you have to identify what kind of ambivalence do they seem to be showing. That's your first responsibility, is to figure out the type of ambivalence.
当我们在体验和感受客户产生的矛盾心态的时候，我们应该去判断客户目前处于哪种类型的矛盾状态当中。
So how you're doing that is you just start talking about the current behaviors. I want to ask them, what don't you like about it? Is there something you like about it? What would be the alternative behavior? What do you think about it? Is there something you like about it? Something that you don't like about it? And you quickly start to understand what kind of ambivalence they're demonstrating.
我们应该去提问客户，让他去描述自己到底喜欢一些什么，不喜欢一些什么，可能存在的替代性选择又有哪些，这样可以帮助我们更好的去判断他到底处于哪一个类型的矛盾心态。
So now I want you to think of scales. And what we're trying to do here is tilt the scales in favor of the better decision. And so we use the word creating discontent or discomfort. What we're trying to do here is simply, if you hate this bad behavior, I want you to hate it more. And if you hate this proposed behavior, I want you to hate it less. I'm tilting these scales.
我们现在要跟大家讲一个非常重要的技巧，就是如果你的客户产生矛盾心理的时候，我们要帮助他去讨厌他害怕跟讨厌的那个部分，让他去加剧这种厌恶感。而对于他有好处的那些部分，他如果有厌恶感的话，我们要想办法去降低这些厌恶感。
So for example, if someone says, I don't feel healthy because I'm not exercising, then some people would say, well, why don't you just start exercising? Because what I believe I have to do is go to the gym 5 days a week, and I just don't think I'm going to enjoy that. So you've identified they hate both options. That's called avoidance conflict. Now let's create discrepancy, or let's create discomfort or discontent.
所以你的客户，当你问他为什么不去运动的时候，他可能会回答你，我讨厌那个运动的感觉，因为我不喜欢1周5天都要去健身房，但是我又知道如果不运动的话会给我身体带来不良的好处。这个时候不喜欢不健康跟不喜欢去健身房就是两个他可能产生厌恶的东西。
So let's talk about them not exercising. Ask them what they hate about it. They tell you, well, I feel lazy, I feel, fat, I don't feel that I'm appealing to my girlfriend or my boyfriend. Make it personal and relevant. Really dig out more. Find out what else. Find as many things as you can why they hate not exercising.
所以当你的客户在跟你讨论说我不喜欢自己比较懒惰以及没有吸引力的状况的时候，我们要更多的去进行提问，帮助他们发现为什么他们会有这样的厌恶感，为什么他们在这种状况之下还没有去运动。
Then let's go to the other side. They say, well, I could exercise, but they tell you they don't like exercise. So let's find out what's going on. Why don't you like exercise? Well, I just don't think I can go to the gym 5 days a week. All right. So we ask the question now, how many days of the week could you go? Would you be able to go 2 times a week? They say, oh, I can go 2 times a week. Well, then say, so what if our plan is to only go 2 times the week? Then they start to realize, well, that's not as bad anymore. So now we're creating that change in this discrepancy.
另外一方面，我们可以再跟客户探讨，为什么你不去喜欢运动呢？客户可能会说，我讨厌1个礼拜5天要去健身房。这个时候我们就可以去问他，那如果1个礼拜去2天，你会觉得怎么样？如果客户觉得这个是可以接受的，我们就自然而然的帮他降低了对好的事情的厌恶感，来达到一个更大的翘板。
So remember, what you're trying to do is just simply create awareness to why the current behavior is horrible, and hopefully why the proposed behavior is not as bad. So you're not passing judgment, you're not making evaluations, you're just simply making observations and suggesting ideas. Let them become more aware of the differences between the existing behavior and the proposed behavior, which is the better behavior.
所以我们要做的事情就是把那些对他们健康来说比较消极的，让他们讨厌的东西放大化，而对他们健康比较积极的，但他又讨厌的东西给降低化，这样子就能够更好的帮助他们产生改变的意愿。
Okay, so let's start talking a little bit about what is needed. So we've spent a little bit of time talking about this idea of willpower, where we're starting to understand why some people have some weaknesses. Then people want to change behavior, so we have to then identify, are they ambivalent or resistant? So we've kind of worked through some of those things. Now we've got to understand, what is it that is actually needed to change the behavior?
我们刚刚讨论了意志力、矛盾还有阻力的部分，接下来我们要讨论的是，在改变的过程当中，我们还需要一些什么？
Okay, so let's look at a process of what is defined as a habit. There's always going to be a stimulus, what we call a cue, that is ultimately going to drive a behavior. So the cue will then make you consciously aware of a craving or a desire for something. And that desire becomes your driver that then influences or helps you perform an action or a response. And then that leads to a consequence. That is a behavioral action. It's a cue, a craving, a action or a routine, and a consequence or a reward.
我们现在来看一下发生行为都需要经历哪些过程。首先，我们必须要有一个诱因，也就是动机。这个动机会诱发你对某一些行为产生渴望，然后我们才会去发生这个行为。行为产生之后，就会产生一个相应的结果。这个是完整的事件发生的过程。
So what is a cue? A cue is simply a stimulus. We call it conditioned or unconditioned, that will then consciously prompt some sort of thought, some sort of emotion, some sort of sensation. And these usually are what we construe as being the craving or the desire.
很多时候，什么时候是我们要了解什么是一个诱因？诱因它代表的是有意识的去激发出来的一些想法、情感，或者是渴望和欲望。
So what's an unconditioned stimulus? It's just one that occurs naturally. So time of day. Why do you brush your teeth before you go to bed? It's just a thing that you do, all right? Why do you turn on, why do you eat at night? Because there's just generally food around, right? These are just things that occur naturally. By comparison, a conditioned stimulus is something that we are strategically implementing, like putting a reminder in your phone, all right? These are called conditioned stimulus. So it doesn't matter what kind of stimulus we have. A stimulus is going to make you consciously aware of some sort of thought, a feeling, a sensation that is going to drive a craving or a desire.
很多时候我们要去思考一下，为什么你会在睡前去刷牙？为什么你晚上的时候会需要去吃东西？那这些诱因它其实都是会进入到我们的生活，然后成为一种习惯，然后被自然的去触发起来的。所以我们可以在这个过程当中去培养这些习惯，比如说去建立一些条件，你可以去设定一些闹钟来对自己进行提醒，慢慢的去把它融入到生活当中，形成一个习惯。
So what is a craving? A craving is just the driving force that moves you to an action. That's all it is.
那什么是渴望呢？渴望它就是一种欲望，或者是一种动力，来促使我们去产生一些行为。
So why do we have cravings? Because when we are consciously aware via the stimulus and it drives a craving simply represents that we're not happy with our internal state. We want a change. We're seeking a change. Maybe it's, I got to satisfy that craving for something sweet or something salty. So in other words, we want to change the current state, and that's usually why we have a craving for something.
我们为什么会产生一个渴望呢？渴望它大部分情况之下是因为我们对现状有一种不满足，而我们希望去改变这种不满足的现象，去满足我们产生的任何的一些需求，所以就会有渴望。
What follows the craving is the action, the response or the routine. And so we do things, but understand that the routine that you choose to do, the action that you choose to do, is often derived by how you think it's best going to satisfy that craving.
在渴望之后紧接着的就是行为，行为通常指的是我们例行的一些公式，或者是我们例行的一些动作。那我们会发生这些行为的背后，都是因为我们有了要满足自己某些需求的渴望，才会产生行为的。
So for some people, if their craving is for something sweet, they might decide, I can satisfy that by having some chocolate. For other people, they might say, I can satisfy it by having a piece of fruit. So the action is satisfying that craving, but we're going through different actions, and that's what we need to change. The cravings will always be there. What we need to do is to shape the action.
我们通常情况下，比如说有人产生了对甜食的渴望，有的人就会选择说我可以吃一块巧克力满足这种渴望，另外一些人会选择说我吃水果来满足这些渴望。渴望永远都是在那边的，我们无法调整，但是我们可以通过调整行为来改变更多的东西。
And so what is follows the action is the consequence or the reward. A lot of times when it's a good behavior, we enjoy the reward. We feel good about it, but it can also be bad. So I want to use the word reward and consequence, right? Because sometimes we're happy about the choice we made, but other times we're not.
很多时候我们在完成行为之后就会产生一个结果，这个结果通常都是伴随奖励的，但是这些奖励不一定都是好的，所以有的时候我们会为自己的行为感到开心，而有的时候你则会觉得失落。
Now, a thing to understand is how your brain works. Your brain is wired, all right, to recognize the rewards that we get from every action we do. So our brain is paying attention to the action and the type of reward it gives us. And if our brain senses that we're getting multiple rewards from this behavior, then we're going to do that behavior over and over again.
我们的大脑运作过程，它会一直集中注意的去观察，当你发生一个行为之后会产生什么样的奖赏。如果这个奖赏是让他觉得开心的，那我们发生这个行为的可能性就会变得更多。
So what we know in this behavioral cycle is that the cues will always exist in our lives. They're always there. The cravings are manifested within ourselves because usually it's a desire for something to be changed. Those don't necessarily change much. The consequence, hopefully positive but sometimes negative, doesn't change much either. You either are happy about what you did or you're unhappy with what you did. So those three don't change. The one thing that can change is the action, the behavior that we decide to do.
在我们刚刚讲过的这一系列的事件当中，其中有3个是完全不能改变的，就是诱因、渴望和奖赏，它们基本上是保持不变的。所以我们能够去改变的就是常规的行为。
So, let's think about this. You're at home. You might be watching TV. A commercial comes onto TV and it's showing something sweet. There's your cue. In your mind, all of a sudden you feel like I have a craving for something sweet. So those things are always going to happen in our lives. Now, what we want to shape is the action. You might decide to perform a bad behavior, which is I'm going to go eat a lot of chocolate. Or you might decide to do a good behavior where you say, I want to eat a piece of fruit. And then the reward depends upon what that action is. If you had the chocolate, you might regret your choice, but if you had a piece of fruit, you might appreciate and be happy about your choice. So we need to change the action, which can then influence the reward.
我们来看一下这样的一个例子，比如说你正在家里面看电视，电视的广告播放了一系列关于甜食的东西，这个时候我们就会产生对甜食的渴望。那你可以看到，我们有了刺激和欲望，然后我们就可以去选择发生的行为。你可以选择去满足自己的欲望，而吃很多的巧克力，也可以选择去吃一些水果。但是吃巧克力的行为导致的结果是，你可能会产生很多的愧疚感，而吃水果的话，你会觉得自己得到了很大的满足。这时候我们就会发现，行为是可以发生改变的，但是诱因、渴望和奖励，它们总是固定不变的。
So, if we want to shape the action, how do we go about changing all of this? Well, one of the things you can do is right at the beginning is create more of a routine, more of a structure. So we know you're going to have a cue. It's going to be the evening where you are bored, maybe watching TV, and you crave something sweet, right? So what we need to do is to structure a schedule and a routine, right? So what we need to do is, if we know that these are going to happen, then our schedule is eating at a certain time, and the routine is anticipating that there might be a desire later for something sweet, so we plan accordingly. So having a schedule and a routine starts to put a little bit of structure around our normal behavioral patterns.
我们如何来进行行为习惯上面的一些改变呢？那就是在我们产生诱因跟渴望之前，就先给自己建立一些计划和有制度的一些程序。诱因和渴望这些都是固定存在的，就像我们前面讲过的，你晚上看电视的时候总是会忍不住，可能会对甜食产生渴望，这时候我们就可以提前去建立一些习惯跟制度，来帮助我们更好的去规范自己的行为。
So what we're doing is, by creating a schedule or routine, we are giving you a sense of certainty and more clarity about what's going to happen. We're putting a plan into action.
我们在发生诱因和渴望之前，就提前制定好这些计划跟程序，为可能会发生的一些行为做好准备。
We know that the cues are going to happen, so the idea is, don't try and suppress them. Make them obvious. Let them happen. But it's okay if they happen. We know what's going to go next. We just have a plan for that.
我们当发生诱因跟渴望的时候，我们要做的不是去杜绝它们，因为这个是很难杜绝掉的。我们应该做的是提前为它们发生之后，我们应该如何去设定行为反应，做好准备和计划。
And if we start to think about what behavior we can do, what we can do is start to shape the cravings. We can say, hey, if we can do something fun or something good, the anticipation of that action elevates our dopamine levels, and we start to feel good about it, so we're more likely to perform that good behavior.
我们可以选择一些好的行为，而这些行为在完成之后会让你觉得很满意，这个时候你的大脑就会喜欢这种满足感，而发生这个行为的可能性就会被增加。
Whatever behaviors we're looking for, we've got to make them very simple. If we make them simple, it's more likely that you can perform them. So we always want to simplify the behaviors that we want out of the person.
我们还需要去注意的是，这些我们要发生的行为一定要足够的简单。简单的时候可以帮助我们更好的去发生行为，减少我们的惰性。
And whenever action happens, if it's a good action, we want a reward, and we need to make that reward immediate. In other words, immediately recognize it. Doesn't matter how small it is, so we feel good about it. And that's also going to increase the likelihood of us repeating that behavior.
还需要注意的是，在发生行为之后获得的这个奖励一定要非常的及时。当你能够及时的感到满足感的时候，无论这个奖励的程度有多小，都能够帮助我们去强化行为。
And so really what this is saying is that we want intention to perform good behavior. So what we need to do is to really build the awareness of what the problem is and create some appealing ways to go about the behavioral change. So we're starting to do what? Develop the strength between awareness and intention.
所以当我们想要去发生行为改变的时候，我们要知道什么样的行为会影响到我们，然后我们提前去做好规划，这样子你就能够得到一个更好的结果。
And so just to expand upon awareness and intention, when it comes to behavioral change, we go through stages, right? In English, they use the words unconscious incompetence, they use conscious incompetence, conscious competence, and unconscious competence. I know those words can be confusing. I'll explain them very briefly.
当我们在发生改变的时候，会经历4个能力阶段，分别是不知觉不足、自觉不足、自觉有能力和无意识能力。
So unconscious incompetence means where you don't know there's a problem until you're made aware of it. And that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to help people become more self-aware of the problem. So once they are aware of the problem, we now have moved to what we call conscious incompetence, which means they're aware of the problem. They may just not know how to fix it because they're ambivalent.
当你处于不知觉不足阶段的时候，你是根本不知道发生了什么事情的，你不知道自己存在哪些缺陷或者问题，所以我们就无法发生改变。这也是我们为什么一直希望大家可以有更多的自我察觉，然后进入到自觉不足的状态。这个时候你就会发现，我需要改变，但我只是可能存在一些能力上的欠缺。
And sometimes they try things for themselves. So they go through this trial and error where they keep trying and making mistakes because they don't have the knowledge, the skills, or the abilities to make this change successfully. So that's why they need us, because we come now and we teach them how to go about the change correctly. And that's moving them into what we call conscious competence, where they're learning how to perform good behaviors.
很多时候我们遇到的客户，他们可能已经在自觉不足的这个阶段了，他们知道自己需要改变，但是可能经过了一些反复的试错阶段，因为自己的能力或者是知识储备不够，没有办法得到一个很好的结果。这个时候就需要我们教练来对他们提供帮助，让他们去进行学习，来进入到自觉有能力的阶段。
Our goal is to move them from conscious competence to unconscious competence. That means they're performing that behavior repetitively. We call that a habit. And so what we're trying to do is to build healthy habits. So we have to understand the process of getting to a healthy habit.
所以当你的客户如果有办法学习到一些改变的技巧，并且把它们完全融入到自己生活的时候，形成一些自动化的反应，他们就进入到了一个无意识能力的状态。这个就是我们需要了解的一个能力变化的完整阶段。
So as I mentioned, awareness drives an intention, but what we want to understand is, why do they have the intention to want to change? Why do they want to change to eat more healthy? What does it mean to them?
所以如果我们希望客户去经历这些阶段发生行为改变的话，我们一定要去深度挖掘为什么他们要去发生这些行为改变，挖掘这些目的背后的一些原因。
So think about it. We have a cue, we have a craving, we have an action, we have a reward. We're trying to shape that into a positive habit, which means we're taking people that have bad habits, which means they could be starting at the very left of this, that they're not aware there's a problem, or that they are aware of a problem, and we need to now shape them to performing healthy behaviors in an automated fashion, what we call a habit. So we have to move them from left to right, and how we do that is by putting that structure in there and then changing the action.
所以我们刚刚前面有讲过，我们会经历一些诱因、渴望以及行动和结果的过程。我们希望客户可以去修正他们的行为，但如果客户一直处于一个不觉知的状态的话，就没有办法达到这个目的。所以我们需要帮助客户从不觉知一直走向无意识能力的这个过程，来帮助他们更好的修正行为。
Okay, so part of what you have to do is you got to dig to understand the why. So I give you some examples that you can read through. You just start with, why do you want to lose weight? Well, it'll make me healthier. Great. Help me understand why you want to be healthier. Well, they might say it makes me a good role model for my kids. I want to dig deeper. Why do you want to be a good role model for your kids? Well, so that we can all live a healthier life. Why is it important for you to live a healthier life? The person might say, because my father died when I was young, and my father wasn't there to witness me graduating from college or getting married or having children. You keep peeling back the layers, and you finally get down to the deep personal reason why the person has the intention to change behavior. That's what you got to do. We're getting down to what we call your core values.
我们可以看到 PPT 上面举到的这个例子，就是一个深度挖掘个人的核心价值观的过程。客户来找你的时候，只是说我要减肥，但是我们可以了解他为什么要减肥，他希望获得更好的健康，而获得健康的原因是希望成为孩子的榜样，去提高生命的质量。一系列的这样的挖掘过程之后，我们就能够得到一个更深层次的核心价值观，来帮助客户更好的去发生行为改变。
So one of the first exercises you want to do together is to help understand the core values. The core values are beliefs that are fundamental to the person. They're something that the person holds dear and sacred. They're what's important in their life, and it's what drives them in their life.
我们一定要去尽量的找到一个客户的核心价值观，因为这是一个人的基本理念，它在指导着我们的行为原则，来帮助我们去做出更多的选择。
So we do a little exercise. So what you're going to do is, on a piece of paper, is ask your person, your client, to identify what are the most important things in their life? What do they stand for? So it could be personality traits, it could be aspects within your life, any individual factor. And I want them just to write them down and then give me a simple reason why it's important. It's helping me understand how the person thinks.
我们可以通过图表上面的这个核心价值观工作表来帮助客户去探索什么对他来说是最重要的。他可以去罗列6到10个自己觉得非常重要的东西，包括了他的个性特征，包括了他的工作、家庭、事业等等，都可以放在里面。然后再通过一些简单的理由来解释为什么他会觉得这件事情很重要。
And what you're doing now is once they've taken some time to do that, you now do a little exercise together where you ask them to take each of those core values, however many they put down, hopefully it's not more than 10, and we're going to ask them to score them on 2 categories. One is on how important they are in their life. Well, if these are their core values, they should all be very important. Like a score of, 0 to 10, they should be 9s and 10s. But then I also want them to score them on how satisfied they are at this stage of their life with each of those things.
我们在帮助客户去探讨这些核心价值观的时候，可以通过2个评分制度。第一个是让他们去评断这6到10个重要的事件当中，他们分别的重要程度0到10分占了多少的分数。第二个就是判断这些对他们来说很重要的事件在生活当中的满意度从0到10分可以打几分。
Now we do a little exercise together. So what we do is we compare those 2 scores. So I'm using my example here as health, sleep, family, and career.
我们接着来做这样一个练习。我以我自己为例，通过健康、睡眠跟家庭这3个核心的价值观来跟大家去进行一个比较。
Now, in a perfect world, the score for importance and the score of satisfaction would be the same. Kind of look at career. 9 points and 9 points. That is basically that person is fulfilling their pursuit of improving their career.
好，我们来看第一个是关于事业的部分，满意度以及我们对它的重要性分别都打了9分，那证明事业这件事情对于客户来讲处于一个相对比较平衡的状态。
But what I'm concerned about is when I see discrepancies like you see with sleep and family, where they see very high importance, but unfortunately the level of satisfaction is very low.
但是我们再来看一下睡眠跟家庭这2个部分，虽然重要性的打分上是很高的，可是在满足度上面的分数相对却比较低。
That's very important because you have to appreciate that they're trying to take on a new behavior, and right now they have a lot of unresolved issues that are going on in their life.
那我们为什么要去做这件事情呢？因为你的客户要发生一个行为改变，所以我们必须要明确的让他知道，他在生活当中是需要面临这么多的事件，需要去进行调整的。
So I'm using the example of the pie chart. Their life is already filled with all these other commitments they have to do. And now they're talking about taking on an additional commitment such as living a healthy lifestyle and all it involves. And they're trying to squeeze it into their pie that's already full or maybe unresolved.
就像我们图表上面的这个圆形的表格一样，当你的客户如果他的生活所有的精力和资源全部都被占据了，这个时候你如果想要他进入一个比较健康的生活状态，就需要重新去分配他的精力、时间和资源。
And so there's a reason we're doing this. We want to do this just to be realistic. It's called a reflection exercise where we want to make sure that the person fully understands this is already what you got going on in your life. And a lot of these things are unresolved, which means it's requiring more energy out of you, more time, more resources. And you're now thinking about taking on something else. Do you have the capacity to take this on, or do we need to revisit it and simplify it?
我们之所以要去做这件事情的原因是帮助你的客户明白，他在日常生活当中会面临到很多的时间上面和资源和精力的占用，所以如果他要去做这件事情的话，他首要明确他有没有办法去腾移出更多的时间跟精力，还是他需要做哪些方面的调整。
The other thing we want to do with this information is also reinforce how this change, so for example, if they're going to become more healthy, how it could contribute positively to some of their core values. For example, if they start eating more healthy, they will improve their health, and it may even improve their sleep, which could then improve their energy levels to deal with a family crisis.
另外，我们还要去发现的是，我们做的现在的这些行为可以给他的核心价值观产生哪些帮助？比如说，他在吃更健康的饮食之后，会提升自己整体的健康，帮助他的睡眠，甚至对家庭还会有更多的精力来陪伴自己的家庭。
The second tool that you want to think about using is called a Decisional Balance Worksheet. It's kind of like a scaling system, and it's real easy to fill out.
我们第二个要给到大家的一个工具呢，叫做决策平衡表，它可以帮助我们更好的去判断自己是否应该发生一些行为。
What this Decisional Balance Worksheet does, it helps you as the trainer, as the coach, understand how the other person is seeing all this change process.
这个决策平衡表可以帮助我们作为教练来评估我们的客户是否有能力去完成他的行为改变。
So what you're looking at is their existing beliefs, you're looking at their attitudes, their perceptions, how confident they are about change, and what you're hoping to do is use this tool to shape it into what we call a blueprint, which is a manageable path to success.
我们通过这样的一个工具，可以很好的衡量出客户现有的一些信念、态度和自我认知，然后通过这个工具再来帮他们去塑造一个可以成功的可管理的一个蓝图或者是模板。
So what we do is we take a piece of paper and we divide it into 4 sections.
我们可以拿出一张纸来，然后把它划分成4个部分。
And what you do first is you ask them to fill out the top 2 rows.
我们可以先把前面的2列重要的一些因素罗列出来。
So the top 2 rows focus on this. So let's say the goal is to eat more healthily, right? Then what I want to know is, okay, if you're going to eat more healthy, what benefits do you get from this? And they're going to list them all, everything they believe in that top left quadrant.
我们在去做前2项的时候，比如说我现在希望自己可以吃得更健康一点，首先要罗列出来的就是当我发生这个行为之后能够获得的所有好处有哪些。
So they might say, if I eat more healthy, I can lose weight. If I eat more healthy, I'll have more energy. If I eat more healthy, I will lower my blood pressure. They're just putting all of those, the benefits that they think they're going to get, into that top left quadrant.
比如说你可以罗列，如果我吃得更健康，我可以减肥，可以降低血压，可以让我自己的精力更旺盛，把自己所有能够想到的好处都罗列出来。
When you've done that, then you go to the top right quadrant and you say, okay, what are you giving up? They might say, well, I could stop, no more beer, no more happy hour, no more eating late at night. They're listing all the things that they have to give up.
另外一边呢，你要罗列出的是，如果这样做的话，你会牺牲哪一些？比如说，我会减少喝酒的一些状况，我不能吃夜宵了，我会减少比较快乐的时光。
And what you're going to do then is ask them to score each of those items in those 2 top rows on how important each of those are to them.
我们罗列出来的这2项呢，都是对于客户来说相对于比较重要的观点。
Now, in a perfect world, they would list a lot of important, they would score the top left as very high scores and the top right as very low scores. That would be a perfect situation.
如果左边的分数会比较高，右边的分数比较低的话，就证明这个决策是非常棒的。
In other words, everything they're getting out of it is important to them, and everything that they're sacrificing is not important. So that would be easy to change behavior.
那对于这个客户来说，如果获得的好处更多的话，改变行为的可能性就更大。
The problem is, a lot of times on the top right, what they're listing as important, they scored very high, which means they don't want to give it up. They feel like it's too much of a loss. What you've just discovered is reasons why they're hesitant to change.
但是通常情况下，我们损失的部分的分数可能会比较高一点，这也是为什么有很多的客户会在改变的时候不愿意去发生行为的一些变化。
Once you've done that, you move to the bottom left and you say, okay, what are the things you're going to have to do on a regular basis to enjoy those benefits? So they're going to say, well, I'm going to have to start cooking my own meals. I'm going to have to go to the grocery store. They're talking about all the day-to-day actions that they're going to have to take in order to enjoy those benefits.
接下来呢，我们就可以把目光挪到后面的2列当中来。我们要去做的事情是帮助客户最大化的收益。比如说，如果你去做出这样好的行为改变的话，有哪些方法可以帮助你去完成？
Now we want them to score that bottom left in terms of how likely do they think they can continue to do that as a habit.
那我们另外一边呢，还要让客户去找得到的就是他在左边完成了一个最大化收益的策略之后，他最有可能的去完成的这些行为有哪些？要把它罗列出来。
The problem is that they score things that they believe they need to do as very low. What they're saying is they don't believe they can do it. So now you've discovered another reason why they may not be starting, because they believe in their mind that what they need to do, they just can't do it indefinitely.
很多时候，你的客户他之所以不愿意发生改变呢，是因为他们在大脑当中认为自己是没有办法去做到这件事情的。
So now we want to start with what I call sustained talk. So here's sustained talk. I'm going to talk about it. It's in the slides, but I'm going to come back to the previous page to kind of help understand it. So let's say, for example, in that bottom left quadrant, they said, I have to cook meals at home in order to eat healthy. And they scored, because of their busy schedule, the likelihood of them being able to do that every day, they scored only as a 2 out of 10.
在客户为自己去进行行为改变的过程当中，我们来举个例子，比如说他为了吃得更健康一点，他就决定自己要去做饭了。那我们可以让他为这个行为去打分。那如果他在10分当中只为自己煮饭的行为打2分的话，要怎么办呢？
Sustained talk is the way that you address the situation. What you will say to them is, I see that you scored your need to cook meals at home every day. You scored it as a 3. And I would say to them, why did you score it as a 3 and not a 1? Don't say, so never say, why did you score it a 3 and not a 10?
所以，当你发现客户的打分是只有3分的时候，我们应该去询问的是，为什么你打了3分而不是0分？而不要
The reason you, oh, sorry, Sandy.
It's okay. 而不要去问他为什么你不是打10分。
The reason you want to approach it that way is because even though they think they can't do it, they're still giving it a score, which means it must be important to them. So if I start the conversation by saying, why did you score it a 3 and not a 0? It prompts conversation on why they see it as important. Because if I go the other way and I say, why did you score it a 3 and not a 10? Then it starts conversation on why it's not important. And you don't ever want to have that conversation.
我们为什么要去这样提问？是因为一个客户如果不愿意去做某件事儿，但他依旧打了3分的话，就证明这件事情对他来说是很重要的。那我们接下来跟他进行的谈话，就可以有效的帮助他去强化这件事情的重要性。但如果你去问他10分为什么没有打到，就会帮助他有更多的时间去思考这件事情对他来说的困难度有多高。
So after the sustained talk, and they said, I don't think I can cook meals every day at home, and I scored it a 3, and we've done the sustained talk, then I ask them to rephrase it. I say, well, let's ask you this. How many days realistically do you think you can cook meals at home? And they might say, 3 times a week. Okay, so if we were only going to have to cook meals 3 times a week, how likely are you to be able to do that? Now they tell you, oh, that's a 7. So now we're changing the scores.
那如果我们去问客户为什么没有打到0分的时候，他们知道这样的一个重要性，我们可以问他，那你为什么会觉得没有办法打一个更高的分数？他可能会回答说，我觉得我没有办法每天在家做饭。这时候我们可以紧接着去提问，那如果我们把做饭的时间改到1周3次，你觉得如何？客户可能会把这个评分增长到7分，这个时候我们就改变了整体的一个评分。
And sometimes when you change the score in the bottom left, you can go back up to the top right, and they may have said, one of the sacrifices is I'm going to have to invest a lot of time to cook my meals. Well, now that they're changing it to only 3 times a week instead of all 7 days, you can go back and score and say, now that you're only having to cook meals 3 times a week, how much of a time sacrifice are you making? And they originally said a 10, now it becomes a 6.
所以很多时候，如果当我们的客户没有办法很好的去完成一个指标，比如说每天做饭的话，我们把它移到每周3次，这时候客户就会觉得这件事情变得更容易去发生，所以他的分数自然而然也会升高。
So what you are doing here strategically is you are manipulating how they're thinking by giving them some ideas and letting them choose the path. So what you're doing is manipulating the bottom left to change the top right. You then bring in some other ideas on the bottom right to change the top right. And then ultimately you bring in the core values, those other core values that you collected previously, into the top left to change the top right. You are creating decisional balance.
所以我们很好的可以去利用到这个决策平衡表，比如说你可以帮助客户去最小化的减少损失，来帮助他们获得更多的好处，也可以帮他们去最大收益化，去抑制他们的牺牲感，也可以通过好处的不断增加去抑制牺牲感等等这样的一些策略方式，来帮助客户达到一个更好的平衡。
Okay, so there are 2 tools you should think about. Collect someone's core values and map out the decisional balance, because when I see the decisional balance as a finished tool, I now know what you can do. I see what benefits you're going to get out of it. I see what you're sacrificing. I also think about what you believe you can do, and I'm going to build my strategies from that.
所以我们刚刚通过那些过程，我们知道这个客户他想要去完成什么，他的核心价值观是什么，他会惧怕一些什么东西，这个时候我们就能够帮助他去更好的去建立一些习惯。
So when we're going to change behavior, there is one model of behavioral change that I'm going to share with you. And this is created by a researcher at Stanford University called B.J. Fogg.
我们接下来要跟大家分享的是一个由一个组织叫做 B.J. Fogg 为我们去建立起来的行为模型。
And his premise is this. Unfortunately, a lot of people make a mistake. They think that if they have the right amount of motivation or the right amount of willpower, they can change any behavior. And that, in fact, is not true.
我们的日常生活当中，很多人都存在这样一个误区，就是他们觉得自己只要有足够强大的意志力或者动机，就可以完成任何的事情，但这并不是真正的一个答案。
So, for example, you might decide, I go to school, and during the week I go to college or I go to work, and I'm going to go to the gym 4 times a week before I go to work.
比如说
Sorry, Cindy, go ahead.
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
比如说，我们经常会下定决心，自己要在上学或者工作之前，然后去健身房，并保持每周4次这样一个频率。
Now think about it. The task of going to the gym is the same every day. It doesn't change. It's wake up, put your clothes on, get a quick protein shake, whatever you got to do, get to the gym. The action doesn't change, but some days you do it, some days you don't. So the question is, you're relying on motivation, and it's not always the same. So he says that motivation and willpower are too unreliable and too unpredictable.
我们会发现，我们要去完成的任务，它根本没有改变。你每天都要早起，要收拾好自己，然后去健身房。但有的时候你能够完成这个行为，有的时候不能。这个就是因为动机和意志力，它们本身是非常不可靠，而且不可预测的。
So he says willpower and motivation are good for short-term behavior, but we're trying to build sustainable behaviors.
通常情况下，意志力能够帮我们进行的只是非常短期的行为改变，但是我们需要去塑造的是一个长期的行为改变。
So he says you have an aspiration. The aspiration is to go to the gym, but remember, an aspiration is not a behavior. We have to build the behavior. So we need to take that aspiration and break it down into small little habits by simplifying the behavior.
想要去健身房的状态呢，只是一个愿望，而不是一个行为。所以我们如果要把它变成行为的话，我们需要把这样的一个想法和愿望去分解成小的习惯，一步步去发生。
So the model that he has created works on a simple premise. He says, don't rely exclusively on motivation. We're going to rely more on what he calls self-efficacy or ability.
我们更多的不是应该依靠于我们的意志力，而更多的应该依靠于我们的自我效能感。
He also said that after you perform the behavior, we have to create an emotional connection In other words, celebrate that behavior, because a lot of times, if we feel positive about a behavior we just did, we are likely to shape that into a sustainable habit.
我们还需要去注意的是，持续的行为还需要去有一些情感的关联或者联系。比如说，你在完成一个行为之后，你可以用一些庆祝的方式来强化它，这个可以帮助我们很好的去养成习惯。
And so his behavioral model is built on 3 components. He talks about motivation, ability, and a prompt, which is the same as a cue.
在我们的这个行为模型当中，有重要的3个组成部分。第一个是动机，第二个叫做能力，第3个是诱因。
And the idea is the convergence of those 3 things, motivation, ability, and the prompt, have to all occur in a certain way for the behavior to take place.
我们要把这3个动机、能力和诱因融合在一块儿，来形成一个行为改变的模型。
But his goal is to build tiny little behavioral change steps, because he believes that if you have small victories and you can start to accumulate these, you start to feel positive about yourself. And so all these little small victories can build a positive association rather than trying something that's too big and failing where you feel negative about it.
这里面有一个关键的点是，我们一定要去用小的习惯来完成成功，因为这样我们更容易获得成就感。可以让我们从小的习惯一步步积累，去完成一些大的目标，然后保持积极向上的感觉。
And so this is how his model works. His model is basically, it has as a graph, ability on the one axis, motivation on the other axis, and then you have this curved line that he calls the behavior activation threshold.
所以你可以看到我们的整个的行为模型，像图片上展示的这样子，竖行的是动机。横行的是一个能力。当我们的整个的动机和能力更加匹配的时候，它们2个聚合在一块儿才能够发生行为。那我们如果聚合是出现在 BAT 以上的，这个动作就会发生。
So his belief is this: when the convergence of the prompt, remember, prompt just cues conscious awareness, motivation and ability, when they all converge and you're above that curved line, the behavior will take place. When you are below the line, the behavior will not take place.
当我们把动机和能力聚合在一起的时候，你会发现行为会产生。如果我们是在这条线阈值以上的，行为激活阈值以上的，那我们就会发生比较好的行为。但如果是在行为激活阈值这条线以下的，就没有办法去发生很好的行为。
So for example, if you look at that curve, if we make the ability very low, the only way you're going to get above the BAT is to have very high motivation. That's hard to sustain for long periods of time, because I already said motivation is too unpredictable.
所以我们来举个例子，如果你现在处于一个比较低能力的状态，即便你有比较高的动机，我们也没有办法去很好的完成行为。
By comparison, if I make the ability very high, which means I make it very simple, where you believe you can do this, then I don't need as much motivation in order to perform the behavior. So it's easier for the behavior to take place when you have high ability and low motivation.
所以当我们如果有比较高的一些能力，但是即便是动机相对比较低的时候，你也没有办法很好的去发生一些你的行为。
So look, for example, in the bottom there, I have 4 situations. Situation number 1. I might say to you right now, let's go run a marathon. I'm providing the prompt. I'm the cue saying, let's go run a marathon. Your ability to run a marathon is very low because you haven't trained, and your motivation is very low because you don't feel like running a marathon. So number 1, the convergence of the prompt, ability, and motivation all happen below the BAT, so the behavior will not take place.
所以我们来看一下4种举例的情况。第一个，就比如说我现在立刻拉你们去跑马拉松，此刻我们跑马拉松的能力是不足的，而且大家的动力应该也不是很够，所以当低动力加上低能力的时候，就没有办法发生行为。
And you can see with number 2, I've simplified the task, but it's still not motivating enough. Like I said, let's go for a walk outside at 11 o'clock at night. Ability, yes, you can walk around your block, but you might think it's not safe. So we're still below the BAT with number 2, and that's why the behavior may not take place.
第二种情况，比如说我现在邀请大家晚上11点的时候绕着街区走，很明显走路这件事情大家都是具备高能力的，但是很多人会觉得晚上11点出门是没有安全感的，所以他会处于一个比较低动机的状态，这时候也不会产生行为。
Number 3 is the same way, except I've just changed it. Now it's something very challenging or hard to do, but you're very motivated to do it, but you're still below the BAT, so it doesn't happen.
第三种情况，当你如果出现很高的动机，但是却没有足够的能力去实现的时候，也一样没有办法发生行为。
And then number 4 is when both ability and motivation, they converge with the trigger. We are above the BAT, so the behavior is going to take place.
所以当我们的动机和能力都比较高的时候，就会触发有效的行为。
So let's think about what we talked about earlier. We have a cue, we have a craving, we have an action, and we have a response. We're trying to shape that action. So the cue has to be provided, all right, in a way where we're above the BAT so that the action can take place.
所以就像我们前面讲过的，我们会有刺激，会有渴望，然后产生行为，并且产生结果。那我们可以去改变的就只有我们的行为，而刺激一旦产生的话，就会让我们出现一个比较高的动机状态。
And so his process of changing behavior, he calls it the ABC. He says an anchor, a behavior, and a celebration.
我们接下来呢要给大家看的这个 ABC 的过程呢，就包含了我们的一个动机、行动，以及我们的一个强化和庆祝。
So his anchor is where he says, if we're going to start a new behavior, that you're already, we're going to find another behavior that you're already motivated to do that's very similar, and we're going to piggyback on top of that.
动机指的就是我们要确定一下自己现在有一些哪些行为是我们具有动机的，我们愿意去做的那些新的行为。
So for example, you might be planning to take lunch to work every day because it's cheaper than buying lunch. But you also want to get more fruit into your diet rather than candy. So the behavior that you're doing is packing your lunch because you're recognizing that that saves you money and it saves you time. So there's the anchor. The new behavior you're trying to implement is to add a piece of fruit instead of buying chocolate at the store. So that's the new behavior. So we're going to use the lunch packing as the anchor behavior.
比如说你现在觉得如果中午自己带饭的话，能够帮助你提高一个更好的健康的午餐。同时呢，我们也可以选择一个更好的价格，不让自己去浪费更多的钱跟时间。所以这个时候呢，就会有意识的去提醒自己发生这样的一个新的行为。
The behavior now is the new one that we want to implement, like the piece of fruit. So what we do is right behind the behavior. So when you're packing your lunch or preparing your lunch, we then choose the fruit to put it with that lunch. So now the new behavior is relying on the existing anchor behavior for its motivation.
所以我们可以做的一件事情是借用已经产生的行为，比如说我们已经有中午带饭的行为了，就可以增加一些水果到这个部分当中去，来进行我们行为的一个小的习惯变化。
And then we want to create a celebration. So have a real reason to celebrate why that's important. You might say, by taking that piece of fruit rather than the candy, I'm reducing my calories, and that's going to help me lose weight, which will reduce my risk of heart disease. Find a real meaningful reinforcement or celebration for why you're doing that.
这个时候我们可以进行一个非常积极的有意义的强化，比如说我今天用水果代替糖果来作为零食的选择，那它可以给到我一个很好的强化，就是帮助我去减肥跟获得健康，那我们接下来发生行为的可能性就会更高。
Because remember, when you start making positive associations, that starts to reinforce the behavior.
Sorry, I didn't get it.
I said when you start to make positive reinforcements, that starts to reinforce the behavior.
OK， 所以当我们开始利用强化的行为去帮助我们完成这样的一个行为改变的时候，我们就更有可能来去发生更好的行为变化。
So this is how he proposes you start things. He says, there's your curve. look at the sweet spot. The sweet spot is the best place to start.
我们要来看一下，有一个叫做最佳点的概念，它讲的就是我们可以从一个最简单的点开始，然后不断的去从有一个能量强、积极性低的这样的一个状况来诱入我们的一个成功，来发生行为，这样成功的可能性会更高一点。
So he says, if you want to make a behavior happen, best thing you can do is to simplify it as easy as possible. Rather than having to go buy fruit and cut up fruit, just take the piece of fruit and put it right next to your lunch so it's ready to go. Simplify the ability.
所以当我们想要更强大的一个成功的时候，我们要把这个挑战变得简单一点，让它更有可能去完成。你可以不要要求你的客户去买一些水果或者做更困难的事，只要让他把一小份的水果放到他的午餐里面，就能够去完成了。
And so if you simplify the behavior or the action, and the person believes they can do it, then you don't need much motivation because you're already above the BAT.
所以当我们去让客户把这件事情更容易能够完成的时候，他就更轻易的可以保持在 BAT 之上。
Now, the person starts performing the behavior and they start seeing victories. What do they start to do? It starts to increase their belief that they are effective, and they start to feel better about themselves, and that starts to naturally elevate their motivational levels.
所以当一个客户相信自己可以去完成这个动作的时候，他们慢慢的发现自己真的能够做到了，就会产生一个更高的动机。
What that allows you to do now is it's starting to elevate the motivational level, so you've got more space above the BAT to play, which means now you can progress the challenge. You can make the challenge or the action a little bit more challenging because you've got a little bit more space above the BAT. So you see how the sweet spot is moving.
所以当他们的动机跟能力都变得越来越强的时候，我们的这个可以看到图片上的红线，它就不断的在向右移动，所以它就有更多的可能性去完成更多的挑战。
So he basically has laid out some steps, and he basically tells us this is the procedure you want to follow.
所以我们可以通过一些阶段性的目标来帮助他们一步步的达成。
So step number one is people have an aspiration. They want to do something. Your job is to break it down into simple behavioral actions.
第一个步骤呢，就是让你的客户可以明确自己的一些想法和愿望，然后把它变成更具体的行动。
Try and identify a lot of different options that the person can try, because sometimes you're going to try one and it may not be the best, so we've got to have a few other alternatives available.
我们要让我们自己的一个计划是多元化的，有可能一种方式并没有办法帮他们达到一个很好的状态，那就挑选一些其他的方式给他们尝试。
And then if you think about his sweet spot, he says the best way to make this happen is to simplify it as much as possible. So he says when you think about all that is involved in making this possible, find the weakest link and start with that first.
我们还要注意呢，是帮助客户把任务分成非常简单一个步骤，然后帮助他们去寻找他们解决能力链当中最薄弱的环节去进行强化。
So for example, I'm showing you time, money, routine, effort, mental determination, and environment. Maybe these are all the things that's needed for you to start exercising, but the weakest link is you just don't want to put forward the physical effort because you just don't have that tolerance for discomfort. So what I need to do is to simplify the task so that you can be able to complete it with a less physical effort. I'm addressing the weakest link.
所以比如我们现在给大家列出了这个解决能力链，包括了时间、金钱、惯例、体力、决心跟环境。比如说你现在想要开始运动了，但是当中的某一个环节你没有办法很好的达成，我们就在这个地方去做一些强化跟策略，来帮助你去完成。
Then he says what you want to do is to find the proper prompts, the proper cues that will remind the person around the anchor moment to perform the behavior.
所以我们需要帮助这个客户找到一个更合理的刺激，然后让他能够达成他的行为。
And then we also have to tie in, if you think of the ABC, we have to think of the celebration. What is the meaningful reinforcements that we're going to use to try and start building this positive association?
我们还记得前面有讲过，每一个行为发生之后都要给大家一个有意义的强化，所以我们可以通过这样的强化和新的行为去建立联系。
So for example, if you are struggling to spend time with your children after work because you get home late, because you go to the gym in the evening, and your kids go to bed, you might decide, I'm going to start walking at lunch so I don't have to go to the gym every night, and so I get to spend some nights with my kids. The reinforcement is getting to spend quality time with my children, and that's your reason for doing this.
我们还可以去帮助客户寻找一个跟他的核心价值观连接在一块儿的，比如说他现在想要花更多的时间去陪伴自己的孩子，但是他晚上要去健身房，那这个时候我们可以选择的就是让客户从中午的时间就开始去工作，不要每天晚上都去健身房，这样子就可以让他的整个的行为跟他的核心价值观联系在一起。
And then he says what you want to do is to implement, in other words, experiment, evaluate, and then obviously decide whether this is working or it's not working.
最后我们一定要注意的是，要通过不断的跟进、实验、评估，然后去检验我们设定出来的这些方法跟目标是否能够有效的帮助客户。
So he uses a whole color scheme. He talks about the green, the blue, the dots, the span. It's all interesting, but we can keep it simple. He says that whatever the challenge is, try it once first.
我们可以看到，虽然刚刚讲了一系列听上去很复杂的东西，但其实我们可以把这个东西做得相对来说简单一些。我们在这个观点当中认为呢，无论你面对的是一个什么样的挑战，都先去至少尝试一次。
Now, once you've tried it, then I want you to evaluate that experience. How was it? Did you like it? Would you do it again? And if they say no, then go to your other alternative behaviors. But if they say yes, then what you try and do is instead of just trying it once, you now try it twice.
所以你可以在客户尝试完成之后去问他，你觉得你的感受是什么样的？如果客户觉得不好的话，那我们就可以重新帮助他设置其他的挑战。如果客户觉得还不错的话，那就可以让他去尝试第二次。
And you keep building and extend that period of time that you're trying this for. And eventually, those behaviors become more automated. They become more of a habit.
所以当我们进行了一段时间的尝试的时候，这个动作和行为可能就会变得更自动化一些。
Now remember, he also talks about how his model can also be used to stop bad behaviors.
这个模型呢，我们还可以用来帮助去阻止坏的行为发生。
And so the way he suggests that you stop a bad behavior is the first thing you want to do is to remove or decrease the prompt.
所以同样的道理，我们也可以让客户先尝试取消，不要去做某一个坏的行为。
Then you want to decrease the ability. In other words, make it more difficult. That's sometimes what we do is if I take the junk food and go make it harder to get, it decreases the ability.
然后慢慢的，我们可以去降低他的能力，让这件事情变得稍微困难一些些。
And then you want to lastly decrease the motivation. In other words, decentivize the person. So give them reasons for not doing it and let them know that if they do it, it's bad thing. So you decrease the motivation.
然后慢慢的，我们再去减少他去进行这些不良行为的一个动机，让他不断的去寻找不去做这些事情的理由是什么。
So this model can be used to build a habit, but it can also be used to take away a bad behavior.
所以这个模型可以帮助我们建立好习惯，也可以帮助我们去消除坏的习惯。
Okay, and to close, I have two quick last suggestions I want you to think about. For a lot of people, we're talking about snacking or eating in the evening. For a lot of people, they get confused between the words hunger and appetite.
我们最后来思考两个问题。对于某些客户来说，他们到了晚上经常会吃东西，而且他们是在饥饿跟食欲之间去做挣扎的。
So an easy way to help identify the differences is based on what's happening, getting a deeper understanding of each one.
那我们就来一起探讨一下，究竟什么是饥饿感，什么才是食欲。
So we generally say that hunger is controlled below the neckline, whereas appetite is controlled above the neckline.
饥饿感呢，通常是让我们产生一种低血糖的感觉的。
Hunger is purely biological. Low blood sugar, empty stomach, body temperature, hormone fluctuations. It's purely biological. It's the body responding and reminding you that it needs to replenish energy.
饥饿感更多的是一种生理反应，它通过低血糖啊、胃部排空、激素的波动来提醒我们的身体，我们需要进行能量的摄入了。
Appetite, as I said, is triggered above the neckline. You see something, you smell something. It could be a thought, an emotion, right? And so it could be driven by many different things. And generally it's no, oops, sorry.
Sorry.
No, I was just say it's generally not a need for food, but a desire or an interest for food.
食欲更多情况下，它是一种渴望，它是在我们的诱因的颈线以上的。它很多时候是因为我们的一些情绪跟想法产生了对食物的一种看法，而且它经常是对特定的一些食物的那种渴望。
So hunger is designed to prevent us from starving. It generally fluctuates through the day. So you eat, it goes away, and then it comes back several hours later, and it generally fluctuates, and it is usually satisfied by just about any food.
饥饿感呢，通常情况下是在一天当中循环发生的。你饥饿了，然后你吃了东西，逐渐数个小时之后不进食，然后你会慢慢的再产生饥饿感，而且它一定是在我们的诱因颈线以下的，它可以被任何类型的食物去满足。
So appetite is not time dependent. In other words, you could be very full, but because it's a specific desire for some type of food, usually something sweet, something salty, something fatty, it has to be eaten in order to be satisfied.
食欲通常跟我们的生理状况没有特别大的联系，也跟时间没有什么很大的关系。你通常在饱的情况下，也可以对食物产生兴趣，而且通常喜欢的都是甜的、咸的，或者让你感觉到有刺激感的食物。
And a lot of times, just like we talked about, the action follows with a consequence where you may feel either pleasure or you may feel guilt and remorse, which is hopefully something you don't have.
所以我们在吃完东西之后呢，有的时候会产生满足感，有的时候会产生愧疚感。
So what we need to do is respect hunger. You shouldn't be starving yourself. If you're hungry, you need to listen to your body and eat. But what we need to do is to control appetite.
我们要做的事情就是及时的去识别自己的饥饿感，遵从身体发射出来的信号，及时的让我们摄取足够到的营养和能量。
And so the best thing to do is to work with your clients is to use a hunger scale.
我们可以通过以下这个饥饿测量表来帮助客户确定他的饥饿程度。
A hunger scale where we want to live is between a 4, 5, and 6.
我一般情况下呢，都保持在5到6分这样的一个状态。
In other words, when you're feeling a little hungry and you're thinking about food, eat something so that you can go back to a 5 or maybe a 6, but don't allow yourself to drop to a 3.
所以当我们有一点点饥饿感的时候，就会开始想要吃东西。经过一点食物的摄入，就可以让你大概回到5到6分左右，有一点的满足感，不会让你自己掉回3分的那个状况。
Because when you get to 3s, 2s, and 1s, you might binge eat and eat a lot of calories.
因为我们进入到3分到1分的时候，我们就会过度饥饿，容易吃下太多的能量。
And we should also learn to stop eating when we hit a 6, not a 7.
我们还要学会在6分左右的时候就及时停止进食，而不是一定要把自己吃到7分的状态。
So they did a study where they compared Americans versus people in France, and they were looking at when they stopped eating. And in the US, Americans generally stop eating when they get to around a 7 or more. And generally what gets them to stop eating is what's left in front of them on the plates.
我们有项实验是把美国和其他一些国家进行比较，你可以发现美国的居民在进行食物掌控的时候，基本上要吃到7分以上才能够觉得满足，才不会吃。而其他一些肥胖人群较少的国家，他们大概吃到6分左右就会停止进食。
Whereas when they're looking at the people from France, they were actually listening to their internal cues of their body and stopping to eat when they felt pleasantly full at a 6.
所以法国的国家的一些居民，他们更多的是依靠内部的提示来告诉自己应该停止进食了。
So 2 lessons here is, number 1 is we should be controlling portion sizes as best we can so that we can cue people to start listening to their body's internal cues and not the size of the plate or the amount of food in the plate, which is external cues.
所以我们要做的一件事情是训练你的客户能够根据自己身体发射出来的信号来决定是否停止进食，而不是依靠一些外部的提示，比如说盘子里的食物有没有吃干净。
And so the last thing I just want to share with you is basically we have a tool that we call a metabolic profile, but this is just simply what we call an eating profile. And we use this tool just to increase awareness to how and what and when you're eating.
最后，我们要通过饮食分析的这项工具来帮助大家更好的监控自己的一个饮食，让你产生有意识的进食。吃饭的过程当中感受如何，这是一件很重要的事儿。
The reason we want to do this is because the reality is if you're going to ask people to track what they're eating, it's very important because we said awareness and intention are big changes of behavior. But the reality is it's very hard to ask people to write down everything they're eating as they go through their day.
你会发现，对于我们来说，我们很难让人们意识到他每天都吃了哪种类型的食物。
But we also know this, as adults, much of what we eat, 70 to 75% of what we eat consistently, and it's usually defined by about 100 foods.
作为成年人来说，我们经常吃的食物，其中70%到75%都是由100多种左右的食物去构成的。
So the whole idea of an eating profile is just a reflective exercise where the person will just simply jot down when and what they typically eat and any particular moods or states that they're in when they eat. So we're looking at the time, the food choice, the estimated portion. Doesn't have to be accurate. Maybe some additional information as to when they're eating it, how they're eating it, maybe what their mood was. So we start to understand what is driving their eating behaviors.
如果我们想要更好的去了解一个客户，他为什么会发生这样的一个饮食行为，通过饮食的一个分析，可以很好的帮助到他们。他们可以记录自己选择了哪些类型的食物，在什么时间去吃的，吃的过程当中的情绪感受如何，甚至可以增加一些备注，比如说吃的过程做了什么，发生了哪些事情，就可以更好的了解到触发他进食原则的一些原因。
So what this gives you as a practitioner is the opportunity to see when they're eating, balance between different food groups, like are they getting enough vegetables, enough fruits, enough grains. You can also look at the estimated portion size. Maybe you start to understand a little bit about what's driving their choices based on their mood or their emotional states. You start to get a better understanding of how and when and what they're eating.
所以我们可以通过这样的方式了解到他选择的食物之间是如何达成平衡的，他对食物的一些标准如何去进行认知，他怎么去控制自己的一个能量摄入以及食物选择的，让我们更好的去理解他如何挑选食物，吃了什么类型的食物以及什么时间去进食的。
So, as we close out here, just my last closing statements, right? Remember, eating is a behavior. So if we want to help people improve how they eat, we have to understand the behavior that's driving their eating choices.
所以吃的这件东西呢，它本身对我们来说是一个行为。如果我们想要帮助客户去调整进食行为的话，一定要了解背后的一些因素。
Now, behavioral change is not easy, as I said at the beginning of this session. But hopefully what I've shared with you is some tools that you can start to use to understand why a person chooses to eat, why they choose not to eat certain foods, how they're eating. You start to get a better understanding of what's driving their decisions, and then using some of those tools to try and start shaping better behaviors or better actions.
行为改变本身并不是一件简单的事情，但是今天的课程里面教给大家的这些工具，大家都可以通过它来帮助你们更好的了解客户发生这些食物选择的原因是什么，以及通过它去帮助客户规范和改善行为。
And remember, these strategies are designed to help you, but not every strategy is going to work with every person. So the idea is you try some. They might work well with some people, but they might not work well with other people. This is where you have to be very flexible in understanding that what's going to work and what's not going to work, and just be patient with it. And remember, even a small change is success.
我们要去注意的是，今天教给大家所有的方法都不一定适用于每一个人，所以在运用这些工具的时候，希望大家更具备灵活性，挑选更适合你客户的一个方式去进行使用。但是最重要的要记住，每一个行为改变都是从小的习惯开始的。
So that closes this session. I want to thank you all for taking time to listen. Hopefully it was a lot of information, but hopefully there's some information that you find useful. I want to thank Cindy for doing a great job translating. I want to thank Idea China for hosting the event. So thank you to Lee and her team. All right. And I wish you all the very best.
非常感谢大家今天的收听。那我希望今天教给大家的这些工具能够给你们产生一定的帮助。谢谢大家的参与。Okay, thank you.
Okay.